Let's dive right into this explainer and tackle a problem you probably know all too well. If you're a language instructor, whether online or in a traditional classroom, you've definitely seen it. Your students have nailed the complex grammar, they've got this massive vocabulary, but the second they're in a real, unpredictable conversation with the native speaker, they just freeze up. It's the dreaded fluency plateau. So today we're going to unpack exactly why that happens, and more importantly, how you can fix it by bringing some really specific, evidence-based tools into your teaching. We've mapped out a highly practical journey for you today. We'll start with the fluency plateau, then move into practical teaching methodologies, leveraging digital corpora, efficient tech inclusion, and finally, bridging the gap. All right, part one, the fluency plateau, defining the idiom challenge. Let's really look at the current state of language learning and define why this plateau even exists. There's this fantastic quote by Art Buchwald that hits the nail on the head. He said, "The trouble with foreigners in this country is that they take everything Americans say literally." And that right there is the daily reality we face as educators. Traditional learning relies heavily on dictionaries, and dictionaries prioritize literal definitions. But real-world fluency, that relies entirely on underlying cultural meanings. When we're just teaching literal translation, we are literally leaving the culture behind. And that brings us to idioms. The absolutely crucial thing to remember is that idioms are non-compositional. That's just a fancy way of saying you can't predict what the phrase means just by looking at the individual words. It's like a puzzle where the pieces don't actually match the final picture. Teaching these requires a massive shift. We have to move away from simple vocabulary memorization and start actively intersecting with the culture. We want to teach students to communicate concepts, not just translate word for word. For instance, look at the incredibly common Italian phrase, in bocca al lupo. If you translate that word for word, you get a completely nonsensical phrase about being in the wolf's mouth. If your student takes that literally, they're going to think you're talking about a wild animal, or maybe some kind of danger. But locally, it simply means good luck. Closing that gap between the literal words and the cultural meaning is the secret to moving a student from just passing a textbook exam to actually feeling comfortable talking with a local. Which leads us to part two, practical teaching methodologies, building the bridge in the classroom. Let's see how we can actually build a bridge over this literal to cultural gap using methods we know work. Now, there's always been this debate in language education about proactive versus retroactive instruction. A lot of educators are actually afraid to actively teach idioms because they worry about idiomatosis. You know, that awkward thing where an eager student tries so hard to sound native that they just cram 5 idioms into a single sentence. But the research tells us that a proactive approach is incredibly effective, as long as we use rich contexts. When you anchor a phrase with storytelling, role-playing, or history, students don't just learn the definition, they learn the nuance of exactly when to use it. So what does this look like in the real world? Let's say you're teaching the phrase white elephant, which means a really burdensome, unwanted possession. You don't just give them the definition. You start with the history. You tell them how the ancient kings of Siam would supposedly gift actual living white elephants to courtiers they hated. Because the animal was considered holy, it couldn't be killed or put to work, so the massive cost of feeding and caring for it would literally bankrupt the courtier. It's a great story, right? Then you have the students act out that exact scenario. They create a mini narrative. When you do that, the phrase white elephant becomes totally unforgettable. Moving on to part 3, leveraging digital corpora. Data-driven frequency over teacher intuition. Let's look at how we can use modern tech to expand on these classroom methods without adding hours of prep to your schedule. 100 million. That is a massive number. To put it in perspective, that is the exact number of words in the British National Corpus. If you aren't familiar, a corpus is basically this incredible database of authentic spoken and written English. It pulls from everything: government transcripts, fiction, radio shows, you name it. It shows us how language is actually used out in the wild, rather than how we assume it's used in a classroom setting. And this is exactly why hard data matters so much more than mere intuition. As a teacher, you might intuitively think, oh, well experienced. That's a perfectly natural way to describe someone with a lot of expertise. But if you run a quick search through a corpus, you'll see that native speakers almost never say well experienced. The data shows that phrases like highly experienced or vastly experienced happen way more frequently. So by relying on the corpus, you're guiding your students toward combinations of words that actually sound natural to a native ear. You can literally pull tables of these frequent combinations called collocations directly from the data. It's such an easy way to show students the unwritten rules of a language. For example, in English, we say large quantities, but we say big trouble. Shifting a student away from a clunky dictionary translation and toward these statistically proven combinations, that is a huge leap toward genuine fluency. Okay, part 4, efficient tech inclusion, the 15-minute fluency loop. Let's talk about how to make all this data actionable for your students every single day. Platforms like idiombridge.com are a really prime example of how you can build an easy, repeatable system for learners. What you're seeing here is a 15-minute loop that visually transforms a giant, complex database into a really digestible daily routine. Step 1 is discovery. Students look for a feeling or a literal phrase and find its cultural equivalent. But step 2 is where it gets really smart, verifying the register. They check, is this expression meant for hanging out with friends, or is it okay for a boardroom? They're checking for those false friends to avoid a really embarrassing social mistake. Then they save it, they practice it, and finally, they can export it to spaced repetition software like Anki, or just print a PDF to bring to their next lesson with you. The real secret sauce in this loop happens right in the practice phase. Look, just recognizing an idiom when you hear it, that's not enough. We need students typing out their own original sentences using the new expression, getting immediate AI feedback on their grammar and specifically on whether their tone actually sounds native, forces them to actively construct the language. It completely shifts them from passive intellectual understanding to confident, active use. Finally, Section 5, Bridging the Gap, the future state of fluency. As we wrap up this explainer, let's look at the big picture. What does the future actually look like for your students when you start doing this? When you combine engaging classroom methods like the storytelling and role play we talked about with tech tools that verify real-world, data-driven usage, the whole paradigm shifts. Your students stop acting like mechanical translators. Instead, they start communicating concepts the exact same way a local would. It completely wipes out those clunky textbook translations and replaces them with totally natural, culturally aware communication. I want to leave you with this one final thought. Language isn't just a list of rules, it's a living, breathing entity. Every single idiom you successfully teach is like handing your student a key to unlock a brand new door into the culture. It gives them the freedom to actually joke, connect, and just be themselves with native speakers. So think about it. Which phrase are you going to use to bridge that gap in your classroom tomorrow? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and happy teaching.